Hello everyone and welcome to Emsi webinars. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're very excited. We have Andy Durman with us and Duncan Brown. Andy is Emsi's managing director and Duncan is our senior economist. It's going to be an exciting webinar, really looking forward to it. Don't forget, if you have any questions, please put them in the questions box on your control panel for GoToWebinar. On your screen, and we'll endeavour to get back to those as soon as we can at the end of the presentation. Don't forget, in a follow-up email, keep your eyes open for this email. You will get the recording and the slides from the presentation today. Keep your eyes open for that. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to you. Hi, Andy.
Hi, Debbie. Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another Strategic Emsi webinar, where we will be looking at the early data emerging on the wonders of lockdown 3.0 and what influence that's having on the economy and the labour market more specifically. So thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you find the information useful and interesting. I have with me my partner in labour market data crime, Duncan Brown, who will be furnishing you with great insights and statistics. Hello, Duncan.
Hello. I should say, if the Information Commissioner's office is in touch with us, that data crime is metaphorical, and please don't send us to prison. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, all above board here. Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely.
For reminding me. Anyway, great. So welcome today. Let's crack on then. So just for any new visitors to our webinar series, just wanted to say a warm welcome and hello and thank you from the Emsi family. And by way of a bit of an introduction, we at Emsi are really all passionate and focused on helping organizations like yours and the individuals that you serve make better, more informed decisions about the labour market. And our view is that to make good decisions, you first need good data upon which to base those decisions. So we focus really hard on building out the most detailed, holistic, integrated and localised insights about the labour market you can get here in the UK, built across a whole range of different data sets, many of which we will dip into today as we go through. So welcome along. And welcome back to long-term viewers of our webinars. So in terms of today's session, our plan really is to cover off three key things. Interested to understand what impact this third and hopefully final lockdown is having on the UK labour market, some early signs for us to share with you, and thought it would be quite interesting to reflect on how this latest lockdown compares to 12 months ago now or so, as we entered that first tentative steps into the unknown territory that was the first lockdown. So it'd be interesting to maybe compare and contrast there, and then really start to think about where we go as a nation and as organizations that are critical to driving forward change in our communities. Where do we go from here? So it's at this point I would like to hand over to Duncan, who is not a criminal, and I'd like you to take us through just some of the key headline insights that we've been seeing.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you, Andy. It's amazing to think that a year ago we sort of might occasionally hear about this coronavirus thing in China. And little did we know that from just a month after that until now, we talk about little else but that. It's amazing the speed at which these things have happened. And I think it's the good thing today is that actually it's a continuation of over the past sort of few months. We've been looking forward more, sort of starting from January, and then now this one, where there's the kind of light at the end of the tunnel, and we can sort of start to look ahead to how we can see sort of a path to recovery. But the big background I always say about this whenever we discuss this is that the big variables in all this discussion are all about health and not about the economy. The economy is sort of heavily disrupted by what's happened with COVID, but that's not an economic problem as such. That's an economic consequence of things that are happening with COVID and the fight against it. And so, it's always worth reminding ourselves on those variables, because they're things that are outside of our normal world, but we have to pay attention to them. And like many of you on this webinar, I've learned a lot about sort of public health metrics and the spread of infections that I never thought I'd need to know, but suddenly we do. And so it's worth reminding ourselves that, the reason why the economy has been disrupted is to fight a disease, COVID-19, that is, really quite profound in its consequences if left unchecked. It's sort of a good meta-analysis that's out there, sort of puts the infection fatality rate, so the chances of dying if you contract it, at 0.68% across the world. And that tends to be higher for older, richer societies such as our own. So there's an estimate there of about 1.15% for a country in that bracket. It's a bit lower for Britain. We're not one of the oldest of the older countries, but we are way up there. So that means about 1 in 100 people, if we let the disease run riot, would die. I mean, that's a really profound consequence. And of course, we know that that risk isn't spread evenly, and that older people and people with medical conditions are exposed to much higher risks of fatality. And of course, these estimates are predicated on the health system not being overwhelmed. And when we've had the lockdowns, a lot of it is about managing that demand on healthcare to avoid that happening. And so, but even at those risk levels, COVID is, substantially more risky than seasonal flu. And that's even before you take into account these persistent long COVID complications that some people have reported as well. So that there's a lot to be concerned about, and that's the reason why this economic disruption is out there. And then on this, the good news is we now have a solution that goes with the problem, because the solution was never going to be economic. It's about vaccinations and reducing the spread of disease and its risk. And having not had a good early coronavirus experience, Britain finally seems to have found something it's good at in the COVID world, and we're the third fastest in the world at getting our country vaccinated. About a third of adults they're now getting their first dose, around 5 times the average in the EU. So that's really quite a striking performance that we've had on this one. Unfortunately, we had some bad performances on other aspects. And the great news that we had from Scotland this week is a study shows that vaccines have massively reduced the risk of hospitalisation. So across the 2 vaccines studied, 85 to 94% reduced risk of hospitalisation. So in the next couple of months, we'll really begin to see that have an impact as the number of vaccines flow through into lower hospitalisations and lower deaths, especially on top of reduced caseloads. And in that setting, there's been there's now a way back to normal. On Monday, Boris, who really does need a haircut, as many people do, set out the government's roadmap, and adults, all those that want a vaccine can have a vaccine dose by the end of July is the government's ambition, and there's some talk that it may even happen before that, actually. And then there's the various steps of schools going back on the 8th of March, and those of us, me included, who have been experiencing the pleasure of homeschooling will be happy to see that happen. Then, non-essential retail and personal care, including those haircuts, not a problem for me, as people who know me well will attest, because I haven't got much hair, but on 12th of April, people can get their hair cut. Indoor hospitality and large events from 17th of May, and then all social distancing rules, hopefully, dispensed with on the 21st of June. But all of this is conditional on the progress with the vaccines and no further surges in case and hospitalizations. And on that, and I know no more than anybody else on this webinar, and so I'll turn to my specialist subject, mastermind style, which is the labour market. So if we can have the next slide, and the wider economy too. And so we'll start off with some facts. There's lots of facts about the economy. It's changed remarkably in the past year. And the first one, which we see a lot about, is the GDP fall. So GDP has lost about a tenth in 2020 compared to 2019, and that's really bad. I mean, that's about twice the speed of the contraction that we saw in 2009 when we had the financial crisis. And you'll see some reports that say that this is much worse than we've seen in other countries, but this is a bit misleading. The ONS have invested a lot in measuring public sector output. And so in a lot of countries, including a lot of advanced economies, they still measure the public sector really by how much money is spent there. And of course, in the coronavirus pandemic, input has remained the same, and the outputs have fallen drastically because children aren't going to school. In fact, I've got one right here who needs to leave the room, Arthur. Thank you. Sorry about that. Right in the middle of a webinar, it never normally happens. And so things like children going to homeschool, children not going to school, outpatient appointments being cancelled, all cut the public sector's output. And so that leads public sector productivity to really fall. And we capture that in UK statistics, but not in other countries. So that one tends to overemphasize the effect that we've had. Unemployment has risen quite significantly. It was 3.8% a year before December, and it's 5.2% in December. And that's especially concentrated amongst those in the 18 to 24 categories, it says there. That's a real concern. But what should be said, and we'll go into this a bit more later, is that unemployment's rise is not nearly as much as we might have feared it was going to be. And it's really back to the level that we saw in about 2015, 2016. So it's not, back then we didn't consider that we had a high unemployment level. And so not too bad in that sense. On the employment side, full-time employment is pretty stable. Part-time employment and self-employment down. Obviously, a lot of self-employed people are people like hairdressers, for example, who have been unable to work, and some of them have just decided to withdraw from the labour market. The same with some part-time employees, if they've been unable to do their job. Some of them, especially if they've got domestic responsibilities with homeschooling, like trying to stop children coming to a webinar, then that also has something to do as well. Then on the next point there, we talked a lot about this last time round, which was we've seen a large withdrawal of foreign national employment from the UK labour market. So around 13% of foreign nationals have left. It rises to around a third of those from the EU accession states, who have been a big pool of labour supply in the last 10 or 15 years. And so that's really quite a remarkable thing. And it's actually played havoc with the ONS's labour market statistics, which are weighted according to the expected population. And because a large number of people, probably something like 500,000 or more, have actually left the country, those population assumptions are somewhat flawed now. Then that fifth point there. So overall, most sectors haven't seen big reductions in jobs. Some have even gone up a bit. But those two, for reasons that we'll all understand, because they're the ones that require their customers to be in physical proximity, arts, entertainment and recreation, and then accommodation and food services, have both seen quite significant job falls. But again, probably not as much as we might have feared at the start of the pandemic. And a lot of that has to do with furloughs. We'll talk about a bit more later. Then, one of those industries, we've got another measure that we can use, so accommodation and food services. Obviously, hotels most recently have mainly been closed, but in November, the occupancy rates just show you how just the sort of even before lockdown, they were hit hard. London, way below even a third of its normal occupancy level for hotel rooms. So it gives you a sense that even when some travel was permitted, these effects were really having a bite. On the retail side, of course, we know that a lot of us, certainly it's the case for me, we've been spending a lot more online because we've not been able to spend in the shop so easily, and of course, most recently not at all outside of essential retail. So in January, nearly a third of retail spending took place online compared to a fifth a year before. And for clothing, because of course clothing shops are mostly closed in lockdown, it was 44% compared to 23% a year ago. So it's really a huge difference. And then that last one there, the flip side is that, while some people have really been affected by unemployment, redundancy, furlough, a large number of us have been working and earning as we normally have, but without the outlet of being able to spend. You can't book a flight to the Costa del Sol, you can't go to the pub, you can't go to a restaurant. And so a lot of us are saving a lot more money than we used to do. And so Bank of England monitor how much people are putting into the bank each month. And it was really high in the early summer last year, but even now it's about twice the normal rate. And so there's really a big buildup of finance there. And equally, while in the early period of the lockdowns, back in the second quarter of last year, mortgage lending really froze up for a while. Actually, the housing market seems to be moving again, helped no doubt by the stamp duty relief. But lending is continuing as normal in large part now. So so there's good news and bad news all in there. A lot of it is not as bad as we thought, but there are still some real points of concern in there. So if you can go on to the next slide, please. So the sort of the headlines on the labour market, and for this we look at things like unemployment, vacancies and redundancies. So on the left-hand chart there, we see how they track over time, and you can see, as I was saying before, that the unemployment rate is really back to the level that it was around 2016, when we generally considered ourselves to have a fairly tight labour market. In fact, put it another way, it's around the level that it was before the financial crisis happened, when we generally considered our economy to be going well. So it's risen, and that's a point of concern, but it's not so far at real kind of crisis territory. The vacancy and redundancy rates are also interesting, because obviously vacancies really did fall sharply. These are based on surveys of employers, and so you can see that the vacancy rate fell to by more than half in the early months of the crisis, but has since recovered about half of that back. Actually, redundancies haven't come back as much, but have turned a corner a bit. And so one of the ways we can look at this is what's called a Beveridge curve, and we've got that on the right hand side. The Beveridge curve tracks the labour market in terms of the vacancy rate and the unemployment rate. And you can see that for most of recent history, so this data goes back from to 2006, we moved along this slope over time. You can see that green bar, which that green line, which was as the financial crisis hit. And so vacancies fell and dragged unemployment up, because there's not enough vacancies to soak up employees. And then after that, until the EU referendum in 2016, we saw it recover. It took a while to get going, but then vacancies started to come through thick and fast. And then all of a sudden, by around 2016, we got back to the point we'd had before the financial crisis. And then quite surprisingly, in the years afterwards, we saw the labour market tighten even further to levels that we hadn't really seen since the 70s. And that's where we entered the coronavirus crisis, which is this purple line, where you see the vacancy rate collapse in a way that it didn't in the financial crisis. It really just had a headlong fall. But because of furlough mainly, that didn't translate immediately into unemployment. But furloughs only held it back so far. We started to see unemployment rise now, but at the same time, the vacancy rates coming back. So at the moment, it looks like we're tracking towards, if vacancies continue to recover, which given the roadmap we would hope it would, and it will take a while for that to have an effect on unemployment. So you can imagine it going back to that level around sort of the 5 or 6% unemployment and just above 2% vacancy rate. So around the labour market that we had in the mid 2010s, which, as I say, was not considered sort of problem territory. It may overshoot that a bit, and that would be a shame if it does. But certainly, back in Q2 last year, we were talking about reaching 9–10% unemployment, and at the moment, it doesn't seem that's likely to be the case. So that's, given the circumstances, that does seem like good news, actually. So, we wouldn't want this situation, but it's not too bad. Now, and a really important point of data for us has been our job posting analytics, because we've been able to track this crisis from day one on a daily basis. And so what I've got here is the purple line across the top is the number of active job postings, the number of postings that we can track online at any point in time. And what you can see is that fell pretty sharply by about a quarter in the early months of the crisis, from March until June, stayed in the doldrums a bit, and then started to grow again, back almost pretty much to the levels that we saw, but then has fallen back since then. But it's quite interesting to sort of unpick why that is. And so at the bottom, what we're tracking is the number of new postings that arrive, and those are the sort of the navy blue bars that are positive, and then the number of postings that are getting withdrawn from the internet each of these weeks throughout that time. And the red line there is the sort of the net inflow. And what you can see is that in the early stages of the crisis, employers were withdrawing job postings quickly, and also not putting new ones on. So new postings fell by more than half in the space of a month, basically, and it stayed that way for many months and has since recovered somewhat. And so you can see sort of from October onwards, it's not quite at the level that it was, but it's not far off it. But that doesn't explain why, because that's never fully recovered, why the active total went all the way up and then has come all the way back down again. And what you see is it's these expiries of job postings. So employers seem to leave a lot of job postings out there in circulation, and that meant that the active total has risen and risen and risen. And then at the start of this year, you can see that big green bar about the third week in January, a lot were withdrawn all at once. And so it feels a bit like there was a clearing out of deadwood, a lot of job postings that had been left out there speculatively. Employers hadn't been hiring so much, but they had left a lot of job postings out there. And as the new year started, perhaps with the lockdown as well, a lot of those have been withdrawn. but employers with fresh job postings do keep coming through on the whole. There's been a bit of a dip around Christmas, as you'd expect. That's the same case every year, but overall it's not too bad. So, although the active total has gone down a lot, the quality of the postings is probably relatively higher, and so it's not as concerning as that active trend line looks. So if we go on to the next slide. So what we look at here is that the purple line is the number of those new job postings newly arriving, and this is a sort of a 7-day moving average over time, and we're comparing it to the same period on the year before, and so it gives us a bit of a heartbeat on what's going on. And at the same time, the green line shows us what's going on with furlough. So furlough data only goes to the end of December, and what we've done is rescaled it so that it's counted as a percentage of the maximum, which was around May of last year. And so what you can see is that as we were looking at before, in that sort of initial period, there was this headline collapse of around half in terms of new posting. There was a bit of a surge back up, but then overall it stayed really around that half level way into the end of July. Really, it was only August, that sort of brief period when we had ETAT to help out and all of that, and we felt that it might be nearing an end, but it actually wasn't, that we started to see an increase. And we can see that that carried on, and actually by the time you get to late October, before we had this sort of the bigger restrictions coming in November, we were actually just touching the normal level again. And you can also see that furlough really reached its low point around then, and then those restrictions came in, and job postings did fall back a bit, but then even as we go into November, December time, you can see that actually they're around the sort of the level of a year before. And there has been a falling off with this new lockdown, which is kind of closer in spirit to the original lockdown, but we're still only around sort of a quarter down compared to a half down on new job postings. So it's not nearly as severe as it was last time round. And so actually, I imagine furlough will have gone up in January because of these extra restrictions. But we seem to have responded a lot better than we did the first time round. The restrictions are less restrictive, and also people have found ways of working around them. Building sites have found ways to socially distance, same with factories. So whereas a lot of those were closed in the second quarter of last year, most of them are back to operation now. And so again, it feels like although this is a tough time at the moment, it's not nearly as bleak as it was in the second quarter of last year. Go on to the next one. These are slightly confusing charts, but they're quite useful because they track that sort of change in job postings compared to the year before over time against the number of new hospital admissions for COVID-19. So this is a real comparable measure of how much the sort of the infection flow is across these two periods. And so what you can see on the left-hand side is what happened in that first lockdown, and both of these periods are about 110 days in all, and they go from darker green to lighter green depending on how late it is in the period. And what you can see is that we sort of, by the time we hit the worst effects on job postings, where we were down at the 50% level consistently, was after the peak of hospitalizations that time. So you see that big bunch of light green in the sort of left-hand side on the left-hand chart there. And basically we ended the period in the real doldrums on the labour market, even though the demands on hospitals were really down low by that time. The sort of the first lockdown had its effect, and we were back to normal. This second lockdown's been different because, of course, we count it from the 1st of November when what we call lockdown 2 happened, and then we had lockdown 3, and so it actually started lower and then peaked, about 60 days in early January. And so what you can see there is that actually the experience has been much more varied, and so the peak of hospitalizations was where job postings hit their sort of lower point, and we've kind of remained around there, but it's still around that 25% level. So the regime of recruitment activity seems to be stable at around this around this quarter down compared to half down in the summer. And so actually that means that the economy is much more adapted to the way it was than the way it was back in April to June last year. So if we go on to the next slide, this is a slightly confusing one, but what we've done is looked at the changing job postings for each of the 2-digit SOC occupation groups, And the lines represent how they've moved from that first lockdown to this second and third lockdown period. And the sort of the y-axis here is about the sort of the estimated impact of furlough, and the x-axis is that change in job postings. And what you can see is that basically all occupational groups have seen an improved position in that time. But what's different is how much of an improvement. So you look at skilled construction and building trades, which were really badly affected there, so that they saw a sort of a 50% fall in new job postings last time around, and around half of them were exposed to furlough, we estimate, in that peak period. Whereas now actually job postings are higher than they were a year ago, much higher, around 30–40%, and their furlough use has fallen down to around the 20% mark. And so you can see that's a huge move, whereas others like sort of textiles, printing and other skills trade and leisure, travel and related personal service occupations, and that one is really heavily affected by sort of the lockdown restrictions, are much more muted than their changes. So you sort of see this kind of different experience, and so actually understanding the different parts of the labour market is quite important. So we can see that some have recovered much better than others, and we've got another slide on that a bit later on that will be quite interesting to talk about as well, where we unpack the job posting change in a bit more detail. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So yeah, a few questions to really finish, and they're rhetorical because I'm going to try and answer them myself. And the first one is, will vaccinations in the roadmap go to plan, as they're sort of going to be the sort of the decisive factor really on the sort of the all these changes? Because if the roadmap goes to plan, the economy can reopen, and we'll start to see this kind of early signs that things are moving in the right direction really hopefully gather pace. And we don't know any more about this than you do, but it's important to get that question clear. If that roadmap goes to plan, then businesses can start to plan their reopening, and many of us are already sort of booking things to do and things like that. So that is really the critical variable, and all we can do is watch the press conferences and check the Public Health England coronavirus dashboard to see what's going on there. So the questions that we can bring some light to. So the first one is, will vacancy growth outpace unemployment increase? Well, as I say, the trajectory at the moment is to sort of bring us to kind of the level we were at 5 years ago in terms of labour market. And if so it probably won't outpace it at first, but as it gathers speed, we should hope that it will. The question is, again, it comes back to this roadmap: will the sort of the gathering pace and the feeling of confidence, because the sort of the government is taking it quite slowly, so hopefully we have confidence it's sustainable, will cause employers to start thinking about recruiting again. That third question, how quickly will hospitality and non-essential retail bounce back? Well, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of us are in a position where we've not been able to spend money but have been able to earn it. Not everybody has, and obviously heart goes out to those that haven't, but large numbers of us either been able to work from home or been able to go to workplaces with social distancing. And so without the ability to spend the money, a lot of us are, have more liquid assets available to us. And so, many of us can't wait to be able to do these things. And so you would hope that that will give us sort of, the demand is pent up there. And of course, some businesses may not have made it through the transition. As furlough comes off, we'll find out about that. But of course, the sort of the assets that they use will still be there. There'll still be shops that can be used. There'll still be restaurants that are there, even if the businesses that run them aren't open. The same with hotels. So it's not a problem of capital investment. It's a question of getting the business there. And so if the demand is there, and people are entrepreneurial enough, then you can imagine relatively quickly these industries can bounce back. A big question is about how much of our changing consumption patterns, buying online, working from home, becomes permanent, and we won't know that until we get there, but that will also have an effect there. And then finally, this one about how much global conditions constrain British economic recovery. There's an additional factor that's thrown in with this, is that our relationship with global conditions, because of Brexit, has actually changed, of course, as well. But we can reopen our economy on current expectations faster than other countries. Most of our exports are in things like goods and business services, which will still be in demand. We, just as here, those other countries aren't as it's their consumer-facing services, which are mainly homegrown, that will tend to be most affected by them. The exception to this is those around hospitality and tourism, who won't be having tourists coming into the country as they would have done in 2019. And so while we have restrictions on people coming to this country, then that will continue to be a drag. The same applies, of course, to the education sector, where there's a reliance on international students and there's any restrictions affecting them. So those will continue to be factors. The flip side is, in terms of the labour market, is that 13% of foreign nationals who have left employment represents quite a significant number of workers that, if the economy does recover at pace, will need to be replaced. Some of those might return, but we don't know how many. I mean, there are good reasons to think that some will have made a permanent shift back home. This country had a large influx of Polish workers in the 2000s. In the intervening period, Poland has been one of the fastest growing economies in Europe. And so opportunities in that country are a lot better than they were when many of those people first came to this country. So it may well be that some choose to make their life there in future. We don't know, is the honest answer. But obviously that could lead to the labour market seeming a lot tighter than the increase in unemployment suggests it does. And so there's a lot of variables that will be interesting to monitor over the sort of the months and years ahead, really.
Thanks, Duncan. Some really fascinating observations, and of course, still early days with a lot of these, and some good questions to pose. I've actually just take a moment now, just kept an eye over some of the questions that are coming in, and I think you've actually, in summing up, knocked off a few of them already. But there's one, I suppose, big question, and interested to get your take on it, which is around furlough. We of course have the budget coming up, and we've been told we'll learn a lot more about what the future holds as part of the recovery roadmap on the kind of financial investment side, where Boris has tended to focus thus far on the health and social side of things thus far. So do you have a feel for the imminent end of furlough is due, isn't it, in the coming month or so? Do you think that's something that will just get kicked out a bit further again?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of assume it will, because for the sake of a couple of months, why not? Either that, or they will try to introduce some selectivity into it, but they've resisted that generally so far. Because you could make an argument that if selectivity was cost-free, you could say that it would be limited to hospitality, tourism, non-essential retail. But of course, actually verifying who fits that, it does have a cost involved, and whether you want to invest in verifying that at this stage seems unlikely. So of course there are intermediate options where you allow furlough to continue but make it less attractive, require a higher employer contribution. So I'd be somewhat surprised if it was totally allowed to totally end when the end of all lockdown is supposed to be only a few months away. But of course they may seek to taper it, partly to give a shove to those that can reopen to reopen. So yes, but we will all wait and see on that one.
And the big question, of course, is how much of that furlough, those furloughed workers will return versus how many will turn into unemployment when push comes to shove, and schemes are delayed. And I think the timing is that's the timing challenge, isn't it? The government is probably going to be working out as it sees key parts of the economy picking back up again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if you think that the end of furlough may result in a surge in unemployment, and there will be some kind of surge, probably. How much, we don't know. I think in a way the fact that furlough has come down without unemployment rising particularly fast gives some hope on that score, but there will be some degree of kind of jobs which are only existing because of furlough disappearing. And in that sense, you probably don't want that increase to unemployment until the labour market is really going again, because business is going again. And so that's another reason to sort of avoid turning the tap off too soon when the end is in sight, basically.
Yeah, and just a further question from Anna, who's written in. I suppose an extension of that, we're thinking about what you mentioned about the disposable income and the potential as hospitality and non-essential retail opens up and the arts sector opens up. Do we see a return? Do we think that actually might take a little bit longer than most would hope because of consumer confidence with the potential for furlough ending, or do you think it's such a big thing that that's not going to have a big?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the whole, in aggregate terms, I wouldn't be too concerned about that. I think, if you're lucky enough to be in a professional job, then you're probably likely to have more disposable income anyway, and you're probably in a better place consumer confidence wise going into this. Sad to say, most of those are most affected by this are also more likely to be lower in pay as well. So, in terms of there's a social dimension which is important in that, but in terms of the economic dimension, in terms of the scale of demand, most of the value will be there, I think. Speaking personally, I can't wait to get back and doing these things. And bearing in mind, it seems unlikely to be able to go overseas for a holiday, for example. I'll probably be spending more money in the Brown family in the UK than we might otherwise have done, and that will be the case for many others, I'm sure. So I think overall, yes, there will be a dent, but probably not too much is how it feels at the moment to me.
Okay. Thank you very much. Of course, if you do, as Debbie mentioned at the outset, if you do have questions, feel free to throw them in. We'll revisit some more towards the end. But thanks for the summary. It's really helpful and very interesting. As you say, we will reflect on one or two other data points in a moment. But I suppose where I want to take it now is, of course, we've been looking at the headlines, and one of in terms of the overview for the nation. But we do know there is a geographic component to this, as different economies are more reliant on some of those sectors that have been challenged hardest, or the ways of working. So you've mentioned London as being an area that has been especially challenged, and in previous webinars we've obviously tracked where hospitality is a larger key part of an economy that of course is then having a disproportionate effect. And so I think just want to keep the thinking going here really about the so what. So it's great to see things are picking up, and I think the challenge I just want to keep throwing out to all of you watching in your roles as key drivers of change in your own communities is really needing to translate this down into what is affecting your local area. Everywhere has its different flavor based on the economic mix, and I think it still remains really critical that we understand locally where the exposure lies, but also where these opportunities lie. And that's certainly a theme we'll be focusing a lot more on as we go forward. And just want to remind you that, of course, the point of putting this information out is we want to help you. And that's the point of our business at Emsi is we work hard to bring that kind of intelligence together and have a wide range of resources, ranging from these webinars, which we hope you find valuable and gives you some good data and insight. And we spoke on the last webinar about our regional labour market outlook report, and that's still worth a read if you haven't yet visited that site, downloaded the report. We've had an incredible volume of requests for local area reports as well, which has been absolutely awesome as we try and illuminate some of that information. Of course, only so much we can share in that respect, but just want to remind you that we have other resources and in our portfolio on our commercial services that of course will allow you to dig even deeper if you're seeking that support. So Duncan and his team have constructed some really helpful set of reports that we can run for very specific localities that we'd be delighted to talk to you about there. And of course, we sit on the wealth of the raw data within our tools and services, tools like our analyst tool, and we'd encourage you to think about how having access to that, if you don't already do so, can help you to really illuminate and track. Things are changing quite rapidly as we are seeing, and we want to put this data into your fingertips. So again, please do reach out. We'd love to tell you a bit more about that. And obviously, if you're in organizations that have access to our data, we'd love to connect you together with our user community to make sure you've got the data that you need. So we have been over the last, well, 12 months now, 8-10 months, really trying to track and understand what is going on and has been going on, and we've been posturing a little bit as to where we might go. I think, you know, the time is right, as you set out, Duncan, that, you know, there's a lot of hope on the horizon now, and a clear roadmap, all being well, and touching wood as I am, that we can see our way through this. And so we want to, at Emsi, start to shift our focus now for the coming months, to really think about the opportunity that is being presented by the re-emergence of our economy. And it's clear to see, as we track a lot of the changes in jobs and activity and the detail that we're seeing, that, you know, talent, skills are at the heart of this. And I think, you know, we are seeing re-emergence of certain occupational areas and industries that were strong before and will be and continue to stay strong. Other areas have really gone gangbusters in this time. Other areas, as we've been talking about, sadly, may be changed forever. And so we really want to keep helping you understand what's going on and really track how the economy is bouncing back. The Bank of England have been recently talking about the UK economy being a coiled spring, ready to bounce forward and re-emerge, and a lot of what Duncan shared is giving us, is fueling hope for that, for sure. And so we'll be looking to track how that opportunity is re-emerging, understanding kind of what industries and sectors and the types of employers that are driving that, critically from a talent perspective, the job roles, and probably more so than ever before, actually really illuminating the specific skills that we're seeing emerge. And again, having explored the data and on the past few webinars, you'll have seen some very interesting skills trends emerging there. And our plan is over the coming months to try and illuminate that for you. So we'll be bringing forward some new data insights, but also got some interesting tools and resources that we've been working on as we think about how we action. It's one thing understanding where the opportunity is emerging. It's another thing then thinking about how we, and I say we as the collective audience, as agents and actors in local labour markets, how we can support that change and be a key part of that recovery. It's clear from the conversations we're having and the data that we're seeing that we're going to need to think creatively about how we help people through the changing labour market and back into the labour market. And a reminder, this isn't just simply down to COVID. Actually, the labour market has been changing quite considerably and rapidly. Duncan's mentioned Brexit. We all have been talking about the fourth industrial revolution and automation in the workforce, etc. So there are lots of changes afoot, and we need to think about how we can help our economies adapt to that. Think about the relationship between the education system and new talent coming into the labour market, and the relationship between what's being delivered and what is now being needed as the world is changing. And really think about where we can, to steal Boris's phrase, build back better, build back stronger. It is really think about those elements of our economy that can really build resilience in our local labour markets. And we've seen clearly some aspects of the labour market that are significantly more resilient in the face of a pandemic like this than others. And so it's a helpful reminder, and we want to cast some light on that. So we have some really exciting content prepared over the next 3 or 4 months for you, and a sneak preview actually here. So I'm going to invite Duncan back into the conversation of just very early signs of what we've been seeing, in particular thinking about how the labour market is responding in this lockdown relative to the early days. So Duncan, do you want to quickly just walk us through the highlights of what we see on the screen?
Yeah, so compared to some of the other charts, this is a simpler one. So on the x-axis here, we have what happened with each occupation's job postings in the first lockdown compared to a year before. And then on the y-axis, we have the more recent lockdown period, November to January. And so that allows us to create 4 quadrants really. So the sort of the average fall in job postings was about 47%. So that's that vertical bar down the middle. And then the average fall in postings year on year in this recent period has been about 15%. So that's the horizontal bar. And that gives us those 4 quadrants. And so in the top right, we've got those occupation areas which weren't too badly affected compared to the average in the initial phase, and have stayed in good form since then. And so you see right in the top right there, you've got health professionals, you've got a bit further below them health and social care associate professionals and caring personal services, which were sort of barely down in the initial period and have either been stable or growing since then. And then you've got this other group just to their left, but inside the 2 black lines there, which are a lot of professional jobs, scientists, researchers, engineers, but also corporate managers, teachers, business owners. Then you've got security and policing at the top there with the protective service occupations. Agriculture held up well because obviously that was an important business throughout. And so they're all the ones that have been reliable throughout. They were good before, relative to the average, and they've stayed good since then. And then you've got this group on the bottom left who have the opposite story. These are ones which were hit hard, and so you see right down at the bottom corner there, textiles, printing and other skilled trades, 70% down in that initial wave, and have stayed hit hard. So even in this most recent period, they're still 70% or so down. And then you've got this wider range of them there, which tend to fit into 2 main categories. Those that are heavily affected because they're in those industries around hospitality and tourism. So you've got sales occupations, customer service occupations, leisure, travel and related personal services. And then you've also got, and this is quite interesting, a lot of administrative jobs and more middle skilled professional jobs. So business and public service and science engineering associate professional jobs, which are, it's quite interesting that they have not been sort of as insulated as the sort of the higher skill ones in similar fields. But the really interesting group is this one in the top left quadrant, which were hit hard in the initial period. So they had worse falls in job postings than the average did, but have actually come back strongly. And so we already talked a bit earlier about skilled constructions and building trades, which saw a 50% fall in the initial period, but is now going absolutely gangbusters, sort of a third up on a year ago. But you've also got some of those other roles, and they tend to be a sort of production, machine use, construction, those kind of things. So elementary trades, process operatives, transport operatives, and then the skilled metal trades just inside that category as well, where they're sort of holding up much better now than they were before. And this doubtless reflects the fact that those are the kinds of industries that were hit in the first lockdown, but have been able to carry on operating to a reasonable degree since then. And then you've got these 2 sort of in the bottom right quadrant, which were hit hard, hit not so hard at first, but have continued to be in the doldrums, so they've remained relatively stable.
Sorry, Duncan, I pressed on a bit soon then.
That's all right. I took the hint. But I was back done anyway, so don't worry.
Wasn't trying to tell you anything at all. And I will move back. And I think actually connected to some of this, I think it is fascinating. And obviously, as I say, we'll be zeroing in on more of the specifics of this, particularly at the opportunity end over the coming weeks and months in Emsi. But couple of things that jump out to me. Your point earlier about economics versus the social impact, and there's a clear sort of trend here of middle to high skilled being in the relatively well placed occupations, whereas the and some labor intensive, actually the re-emergence of that entry level and labor intensive end, and the big question over that is that a short-term jump or is that here to stay, especially as we think about the automation agenda and where that exposure is greatest. So that's an interesting one to kind of triangulate there. And it's that sort of middle skilled, service orientated largely that is feeling some of that pain. And then the big question is, does that re-emerge as it was once the artificial locks have been removed, or is there a shift here? And I think that's something we will need to keep an eye on as the economy re-emerges Do we see those shooting back up?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the thing, that the service ones especially, a lot hinges on how quickly it recovers and whether there are any persistent changes in buying habits. Do people commute less? Do people buy online more? So that could have an impact there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, from a social perspective, the recovery in those production and construction roles is really quite valuable. The other thing that's worth saying across both of those categories, the production and construction and the service industries, is that, of course, they were tended to be kinds of jobs that were very dependent on EU accession state employment. And so insofar as there has been a departure of workers from those countries, in the immediate term, they will be harder to replace if those jobs come back on. And in the longer term, we'll have to see how many of them do return as well. So it's quite an interesting additional dimension on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And to the point of pent-up demand, I think the skilled construction and building trades is an interesting case study that we might think to apply elsewhere in the economy. I know from personal experience, because we were going through a renovation at home throughout the first lockdown, and we were able to help our contractors continue socially distanced and in a safe manner. Trying to get hold of them now is very difficult to get finished off, because actually that 6-month period where in the main a number of people were unable to work, that work needed still to be done. I know from talking to our plumber that he was halfway through a number of bathrooms and very awkward position for some of his customers. But not only has that work that was pent up during that time still needed to be done, that hasn't gone away. There's also now a massive new demand layering on top of that, and it's really playing catch up and quite incredible to see in that. And some of that demand was restricted also by supply, so getting hold of plaster and other pieces of supply. So that's an interesting case study for the lockdown periods, that it would be interesting to see if that applies, as we've talked about, to those sectors that just really haven't had that a chance to bounce back properly. So yes, one to watch for sure. So thank you very much. Really interesting note to end on for sure, and a good hint towards where we're going. And then on that point, just wanted to point you towards our next double act, which will be really about thinking about that topic of skills at the heart of the economic recovery. And we have an exciting resource that we will be making available and telling you about on that. So be sure to sign up to the webinar. It's on our webinar page now. You can sign up now. We will also be looking, as I say, into some of those emergent trends and moving on from that last slide as we looked at there. We also have another webinar coming up in March aimed at our skills and education customers. And as we think about the re-emergence of the labour market, one of the areas that we're working in, particularly with colleges but also universities, is really showcasing the connectivity between an institution's education offer and local employment demand. And so I think as we try and nurture our communities through this period, it's a great opportunity for education providers to really showcase the role that they will be playing in helping us move the needle on that. And we'll have a great case study from one of our customers at Wakefield College, who'll be talking through some of the work that they've been doing to inspire their communities through learning into the labour market. So be sure to, if you're interested in that, sign up there. So we have 5 more minutes remaining in this hour slot. Couple more questions that are coming through. An interesting question about regional variations and regional variables, which I think I hinted at earlier, and probably something we'll start to major in a bit more as we go through. But absolutely, whilst there are some common themes, there's certainly some significant regional shifts. Sorry.
I mean, if I just chip in on that one, I think most of the regional variation, I think, is pretty much explainable through the industry mix. And so if you think about areas that have a high concentration of hospitality and tourism, then they're the areas that have been hit hard and continue to be hit hard. And they really come into sort of two categories, really. There's the kind of the coastal and areas of natural beauty type places. So, parts of Wales, Cumbria, Cornwall, places like that. And then London, because London is obviously a place with a huge kind of tourist economy and the hospitality economy. And I mentioned earlier about the sort of the hotel occupancy data showing it was down at 21% compared to 86% in the November before. And so, and of course, London also has a different kind of hospitality demand, which is the sort of the business hospitality demand. And so all of that has kind of gone missing. And so those are the ones where I think you see the biggest effects. The rest of the country, much more mixed, and certainly since the production and manufacturing and construction industries have come back, that has evened it up quite significantly. In the very early days, places which had higher concentrations of sort of business services, professional services, were probably the best place, whereas now many of the other regions which have much more of an industrial economy are sort of doing much better than they were.
Yes, and thinking about our sort of changing focus, I think the interesting thing will be in how places respond. So whilst those factors are in industry mix related, I think how the skills, economic development, and employment communities rally together in localities is going to make a very big difference. A lot of programs and projects either underway or about to start that are only as good as how they are deployed in local economies, and I think that's going to be a critical factor. And again, reinforcing why good data for those localities has got to be critical in pulling in the same direction and really joining together those opportunities. And we're excited to be helping a good number of communities in that respect. We will be, I think that's covered pretty much all the questions, so thank you very much. Obviously, feel free to throw them to us either via the website, or if you have our details, do so. But thank you so much for joining us. We will be, as Debbie mentioned, circulating a recording of the webinar, so you have copies of that and slides as well, which were a couple of questions come in on that one, so we'll make sure that you get slides. I think Duncan, you're also penning a little blog article as well that'll go up onto the website that will provide some explanation. So thank you, Duncan, for sharing your wisdom with us, and thank you everyone for joining us. Thanks for the questions. Thank you, Debbie, for hosting us so well again today, and thank you everyone for the work that you're doing, and excited to see the successes as we turn this big corner and look to a brighter future for our localities and our regions. So best of luck and stay safe, and hope to speak to you and see you soon.
Thank you. See you soon.